All right, good morning. My hope will be that this morning that will be that I'll kind of meet you where you scratch where you itch, and that we'll kind of deal with some of the things that that are significant with the people that you deal with. Be aware. Be aware that there's a lot of this stuff it can. Let me start over. Let me kind of use a whole sentence. Would that be good? I think I'll try to actually use a sentence. Dealing with people is a sacred task. Dealing with people's souls, and I want to be real careful that this doesn't sound too simplistic, and that we just say, oh, you apply this, do this. People are much more complex than that. We are made in the image of a infinite and mysterious and powerful and knowable God, and if we're made in His image, and we even just have a little bit of that complexity and delight and mystery and of that God, if we just have a shadow of that in our design, we are not people that you just apply formulas to. A human being is not a mechanical being that needs to be fixed. It is a relational being made in the image of God with things that must be faced. And so often what we do is we try to fix people, and we try to treat them like they're a machine or they need a tune-up, and obviously apply things. And the Bible clearly has principles to apply and categories to understand through. But be a little bit careful that I don't want to be overly simplistic. What I'm assuming is that the vast majority of you are people in ministry who care for others. And so I'm going to try to give you the what I'd want to know when somebody's coming in and I'm going to see them. And I realize that for some of you that means a conversation as you're walking to the sanctuary, and for some of you that might mean a conversation at Starbucks, and for some of you that might mean they're in your small group or you're discipling them in some way. But even that, it's helpful to kind of have some categories to think in when somebody begins talking about their life and the issues around them. It would be wise, especially if the person you're dealing with has significant trauma in their past or is dealing with some of the things that we'll talk about. It's really a good idea. I would highly recommend that you refer those people, not because you're not capable, but because you want to have a role of a shepherd in their life. You want to have a role of somebody who walks with them in their lives. And in that case, you can do that probably more effectively if they're going to somebody else to do some of that heavy lifting, and then they come back to you and say and tell you how it was, and you keep track of them. But given that, it's still helpful just to have some categories to know what questions, what are, because we want to have conversations that matter with people, and everybody ought to be having conversations that matter with people. And so some categories, I think, biblically, to kind of help you think about those kind of categories would be the hope. And so yesterday, who was not here yesterday? Anybody not here yesterday? Well, good. Well, great. I'm glad you came back. You never know. You do something like this, and it's optional the next day, and it costs money, and and they're not giving out donuts. You wonder, will anybody do that? And so the fact that you came back is a good sign. I appreciate that. So if you remember yesterday, I said we're going to avoid, and I'll do some question and answer stuff. If so, there's an invitation to you anytime if you have a question while we're talking. I would love for this to be more conversational than presentational. I'm used to teaching in a classroom where students interact a lot, so you're very welcome to do that. I would. This is not a yes.
I like your quote. Human beings are not a mechanical being that needs to be fixed, but are complex relational beings that need to be.
That needs with relational things that need to be faced. In other words, we need to live in truth. I mean, what did Jesus say? The truth will set you free, as opposed to necessarily thinking that I need everything's going to be, tweaked up.
Relational things that need to be fixed.
Yeah.
No.
Faced.
Faced. Okay, that's what I meant.
That's probably a hybrid of a Larry Crabb quote changed by 15 years of just lecturing and talking. I think he said something similar to that at some point. There, by the way, none of my ideas are original ideas. Let me just tell you that from the very beginning. Other than the stories of my family, there's nothing original that I offer you. I hope that it's biblical, and I've clearly taken from the people that have taught me over the years. But so those would be the ways to interact for our day. We'll take a break about every 3.5 minutes. We'll take a break about every hour or so. And if you have a question that you would rather not ask to everybody, but you want me to deal with it, just write it down and set it on this stool while we're in break, and I'll try to start each session with dealing with those questions. Okay? All right. Yesterday we talked about depression, and I tried to give you, if you could just imagine kind of a tool belt as you're kind of sitting with people. If the common cold of mental illness is depression, I tried to give you some categories. I think by the end of the day we had 3 categories or 3 things on the tool belt to kind of help you deal with depression. And one of those is kind of what might be the spiritual, psychological piece of depression, that you can always deal with those sort of questions of someone's blocked goal or loss that they've had in their lives. You can always have conversations about that. I gave you, I talked about how to have a little bit of an idea of biology versus spiritual, and it's really not versus, it's really both. But how to kind of see that a little bit. And then we talked about the difficult issue of suicide, but in all those, try to give you a very practical, something to hold on to. And somebody says that, what do I do with that? And so now we're going to move to the other set of things. And there are people in the field of Christian counseling that say, don't use the labels the world gives you, and so, because that's we don't follow those labels the world gives us. We just, if it's not in the Bible, we're not going to use it. Well, and I think I understand that, and I want everything we say to be biblical. I'm going to use the labels that the culture uses, because that's what the people will use when they come talk to you. I mean, when somebody comes talk to you, they're not going to say, they'll probably not use biblical categories. They will probably say things like, I went to the doctor and they said I had a panic attack, and you won't find panic attack in Scripture. Somebody will say they have an eating disorder and they're anorexic, and you won't find that in Scripture. And so I'm not trying to be not biblical by using that language. I'm just trying to communicate in the categories that the world will use when they talk, when they're sitting around with you in your home, or when you're discipling them. This will be the language that the doctor would use with them, or when you refer them to somebody to kind of deal with it. This will be the categories that person will be dealing with. And so I'm not trying to be unbiblical, and I'm not trying to subtly say, that anything. There's no message in it other than, to me, it's just a real practical way to talk about it, because that's how people talk about it. So when I say anxiety disorders, immediately some people go, anxiety disorders, that doesn't sound very biblical. And clearly this idea of nervousness, the idea of anxiousness, the idea that fear, clearly the Bible would speak often to that. One of my favorite places where the Bible speaks of that is when Paul says we've not been made a slave to fear again. And then he contrasts that. He contrasts that with, you've been given the spirit of sonship, or the spirit of adoption, that allows you to call God Abba. And by the way, if you're ever speaking somewhere or talking or teaching, always turn your phone off prior so that you won't get little messages all the time. And so let me do that. The passage then goes on to say, but you've been given the spirit of adoption or sonship that allows you to call God Abba. And what's amazing about that passage is that it contrasts fear and anxiety to relationship and identity. It says, don't be a slave to fear. Instead, work real hard. No, it doesn't say that. It says, instead, see yourself as his adopted child, so much so you can call him by the same intimate name that Jesus called the Father in the Garden of Gethsemane. The term Abba, Father, is only used twice in the New Testament, and it's used there. It's a word that often Bible translators don't like to translate because it seems disrespectful. It's so intimate. Some people will say it means daddy. It has more respect to than that in the language, but it is a very personal, loving word for father. And Jesus uses that same word in the Garden of Gethsemane when he is speaking to his Father about what's about to take place. And so the idea in that passage is don't be a slave to fear. Instead, know who you are. And by the way, call him by the same intimate name that Jesus calls him. And then that's, so anxiety, if you will, fear is contrasted with identity and contrasted with position, if you will, in relationship, which is kind of interesting. So let's talk about anxiety. Anxiety would be the anxiety disorders are the second most common disorders that you'll run into. And they're the second most common things that tend to be medicated. And here's just here's kind of for your tool belt. I'm gonna give you a very simple thing to say what anxiety disorders, where they come from, and it'll be really simple. And then I'll spend about 20 minutes making it really sound a whole lot more complicated than that. But when you're just sitting there talking to somebody and you say, "Where do I go?" They seem real anxious. What can I talk to them about? I could tell them to read scripture, good idea. I could tell them to do a lot of other things, but what do I do with anxiety? And so let me. Here's the very simple thing. Anxiety is about control. Anxiety is about control. Now, what do I mean by that? Just going to put that on your tool belt. So when somebody's talking and they're nervous, they're an anxious person, you in the middle of your mind say, okay, there's something going on that has to do with control. Now, what do I mean by that? We don't control the things that matter most to us. You know that. I mean, this could be an anxious moment for some of you. The things that matter most to me, I don't control. Things that matter most to me, like today, I hope this goes well, and I hope God's pleased by our time together. I hope it's a helpful time. But I think what I want most is I want to make sure my family's okay. I hope nobody makes fun of my son today. I hope my wife's not in a car accident. I hope I hope my other son doesn't fall out of a tree because he works in a zip line course. He's an assistant manager in a zip line course, and I'm always thinking, my son spends most of his day 35 feet up in the air going, all right, hook on, and I think, well, is that a good thing? Or, I hope my daughter is making good choices in Gainesville. I mean, since she made a bad choice to go to the University of Florida to begin with, it concerns me about that. Those are the things that matter most to me. I want to end my journey well with the Lord. I maybe have a little control over that, but not near as much as I would hope. And so the things that matter most to me, I don't control. And what that makes you is anxious. And what people tend to do is there's kind of a principle in life. People tend to only fight battles they think they can win. So if I can't control whether someone loves me or not, I can control whether my closet's clean. I may not be able to control whether or not I have anybody respect me, but I can control whether or not the garage is in order. I may not be able to control and what I just described to you is some of the symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder, which is an anxiety disorder. And essentially, one of the things that's underneath that is a desire to have control, to have order, to have control, and usually that's related to things are out of control. And people with true obsessive compulsive disorder, the reason it's called an anxiety disorder is when they're under more stress, they tend to try to organize things more. They tend to make sure all their shirts are in order, and because it's related to anxiety or control issues. Does that make sense? Now, so the real simple thing to say, somebody's coming in and they seem like an anxious person, or they tell you they're having panic attacks, or somebody comes back from the military and you hear them say something like they've been diagnosed with PTSD, or somebody says that they're taking something for they've had for generalized anxiety disorder, or you just happen to notice that when you set the thing on the table that they straighten it all up. What all those have in common is they would all fit under the umbrella of an anxiety disorder in the way that people like me think. The people that in the field of mental health would call all of those things anxiety disorders. Now, and so you want to think, since it's above our pay grade to give medicine, it's above our pay grade to give diagnosis, and it's above our pay grade to do therapy with them, because we're disciplers and ministers and Sunday school teachers and that sort of stuff. What we're going to do with them is we're going to at least be thinking, well, I could ask questions about, I could begin a discussion about issues in their lives, both historically, long in their past, and present, places where they feel out of control. Because then you're on the edge of the things that are going on in their heart and their soul. Now, I told you I was going to give you something very simple to think about when somebody comes in with anxiety issues, and now I'm going to really make it very complicated. It's not quite that simple because people's brains are different. There are people who have more anxious brains. Now, you know, there are people there are people in this room right now who their mind just never stops. I mean, it just spins. It's just spinning. You've had 16 conversations with people that aren't even in the room already this morning, and it's not that you're crazy. It's not like you really think those people are having a conversation with you, but your mind just is a spinning mind. You don't sleep really particularly well. Your mind is, and you're kind of hyper vigilant. You're doing that, and that is not because you don't trust Jesus, and that's not because you are an evil soul. It's because you have a brain that kind of spins. And sometimes I kind of talk about that, that if you can imagine, and this is, our medical doctor did not come back, is that true?
Yeah.
Oh no. Please forgive me. What I'm about to say will truly, if you don't stand up and run out going, heresy, who have we brought here? I'm in real trouble. Think of a brain. I'm not even going to look at him while I say it. When you see people, think of a brain on a continuum between a farmer's brain and a hunter's brain. On one side, you've got a hunter brain. On the other side, you've got a farmer brain, and you've got a continuum in between. What's a hunter's brain do? Well, you're in the jungle. You're in your and it's a very anxious brain. It's paying attention to all the nuances. It's looking around. It's because any a good hunter needs to notice nuance and has to be hypervigilant and is changing and it's always looking. And then think of a farmer's brain. What's a farmer need to be able to do? Okay, we're gonna get this hoe and we're gonna put it in the ground and we're gonna make a real long straight line, and then I'm gonna come back and I'm gonna put the seed in every 6 inches, and that's a hunter brain, right? That's a farmer brain. Now everybody's somewhere in between those two. People that are more anxious tend to have hunter brains. People that aren't anxious at all have farmer brains. Now, please, never go to your physician and say, I think I need some medicine because I've got a hunter brain. They will put you away. They will say, I don't know who you've been talking to, but there's no such thing. So I'm just saying that it's just a way for, I think sometimes in our culture, because we tend to like farmer brains better, we tend to vilify hunter brains. And in some cultures, if you don't have a hunter brain, you get eaten by the lion. And so, but in our culture, we have slowly become a little more excited about farmer brains and hunter brains. Now, somewhere in that continuum, put yourself somewhere on that. Do you have a more anxious, and you say, if you have a brain that's a little more on this side, you're going to be more anxious even if you trust Jesus just as much as the person over there. You're going to be a little more nervous. You're going to be a little more anxious. You're going to be a little more, you're not going to be able to rest quite as quickly. You're going to be more anxious than somebody with a farmer brain. And when we all know people like that. I mean, I've met people that, like, the house is on fire and they go, well, I think it'd be a good idea for us to gather and leave, or we might die. And you're going to go, and then we have all met people on the other side that it's like, oh, and you just go, it's not really a fire, there's just smoke. You know, I mean, it's like, and they're going, well, and that's not a matter of trusting Jesus more or less. It's just the way our brains are made. Which one would be able to go to sleep quicker? Farmer brain usually goes to sleep quicker. Which one would deal with, now when a hunter brain, this is what's really interesting, when a hunter brain finds themselves in a place where they're completely out of control and it no longer works, that's a real crisis. They'll often go for medicine at that point because life isn't, or they'll go for help because it's not working. But what I tried to just say to you is everybody's brain's different and that it's not an even playing field in the area of anxiety. Some people's brains are more anxious. I think of my son Skylar, who's, we've talked about a little bit, his autism. One of the things about autism is that his brain gets locked on things, obsessive compulsive stuff. And you can't discipline that out of him. I mean, we'll go to the grocery store and he'll decide that he'll want to know if we locked the car. And I'm in the grocery store, well, Skylar, it's okay. Don't worry about it. He goes, I don't think we locked the car. And I said, son, doesn't matter. It's okay if we didn't lock the car. If we did, we're okay. And then he'll go, Dad, I don't think we locked the car. We need to go lock the car. And I said, Skylar, somebody might steal stuff from our car. There's nothing in there. We're fine. Nothing to worry about. And he's going, no, Dad, I can't. And he can't. There's something going on. His brain is very obsessive compulsive. There's something that gets stuck in there, and that is not something you can discipline out by, you just need to quit that. Quit that. I mean, I tried that for a few years with him. It didn't work very well. It would almost create more anxiety because now I'm trying to, do you understand what I mean?
Where is the point where you continually impatiently give in to the person who's anxious about something versus trying to draw the line and saying their anxiety is not logical, it doesn't make sense. You know what I mean? Like the car thing. Yeah. At what point do you say or try to draw him into your world, or can you, versus saying I'm going to lock the car every time he's anxious about it because this is a concern for him, even if it makes no sense to us. Yeah,
there are times when it's just not possible or convenient to go back and do the thing he's obsessed about. And then this is when I say, son, we're just going to live in that tension. And he'll talking about it. I just don't need to yell at him when he asks again. I just need to say, son, I said it was okay. We're not going to go back out there. We're not going to go back out there. And I'll give you an example. We moved 13 years ago. We moved from Dayton, Tennessee, smaller than this room, to Orlando, Florida. And my son Pierce, my other son that I've told you stories about, someday my children are going to sue me for ruining their lives by going and telling stories about them, I'm sure. But we lived in Dayton, and my son Pierce, he just loved Tennessee. He loved the outdoors. He was, and we lived where there was a lot of land, and he would go on the farm next door, and the guy said it was okay, and they'd camp all the time, and he was just kind of an outdoor kind of, and his best friend there was name was Chase. That has some significance in a few minutes. And so we knew it'd be kind of hard for him to move to Orlando, Florida, where the amount of land that H. Pearson owns is about this much, and he went from a school, the entire county probably had 5,000 people in it, to the church we went to the first week probably had more members, and so it's like, my goodness, it was a pretty big deal. So we knew it was going to be hard. So when we went back up to get the last stuff out of our house, it was just he and I, and loaded up our pickup truck, and it was just he and I in the house, and we kind of finished, and we prayed, and his friend Chase came over. We were talking, and I said, son, this is, I know this is hard, but this is what we think, this is what God wants for us to do. And he said, okay. And his friend Chase is, kind of a little bit weepy. And then so we like I said, we prayed, and then we got in the car. He and I get in the car, and Chase, who lived across the street, was standing there, and we pull out of the driveway, heading, our house is closed for the last time. We're on our way. And Chase starts running after our car, our truck, and I'm going, what do you do? I mean, do you open the door? Do you speed up? Do you slow down? I figured he wouldn't make it to Atlanta. I figured, there's a point where he's not coming. But and I look over, and Pierce is just, just lip quivering, just at this point he's 13-year-old, 12-year-old kid, and just, going, man, I'm losing everything that matters to me. And there's my buddy chasing our truck, and there's my dad driving away. And I'm thinking, what do you say? How do you do that? We get down to Florida, and we get in and I noticed the first couple of nights he had his room meticulously set up. So I go in, I sit down, we're going to do our kind of good nights, prayers and stuff. And I picked up something, a stuffed animal or a toy or something, and just threw it on the floor like would be normal in our house. And I saw him kind of look over at it. And so then we talked, and we prayed, and I get up to say, and he goes, Dad, would you pick that up and put it back? And I didn't think anything of it the first time. I did, and put it back. And then I noticed that he started trying to order his world. Now, what was going on with him? He wouldn't have known it. But what was going on with him was the things that mattered most to him. His friends, his life. I mean, he's got a 12-year-old. His whole life was Dayton, Tennessee at that point. It's what he remembered. It's where he'd lived for 10 years prior to that. And he no longer had that. Didn't know anybody. It's too hot to go outside in the summer. And he started ordering and so when I realized that, I decided that, and so after a couple of nights of this going on, I finally went in and I picked up something and moved it, and I said, I know that bothered you, that I took it out of the order, but we're going to leave it out of order. And I'm going to sit here with you until you're calm enough just to go to sleep with it being out of order. Because it's not about your toys. It's about you're sad. And we're going to talk about the fact that you're sad about being here. And, he said, that's not it. I just like it. Then no, And so for the next few nights, that's what we did. I moved stuff, sat down, and he got anxious, and then we sat there till the anxiety went away. Talked about it. Now I wish he had a little more of that obsessive compulsiveness, because, he moved out. You should see the room. I can't imagine what his house with the housemates look like. I'm sure it's a goat rodeo. I'm sure it's just an absolute chaos. But what he was doing was he was ordering his world. It was a matter of control. Does that make sense? There were two hands up. You're first and you're second.
I've seen the opposite. Like you said, he was messy. someone is trying to control them. Can you speak to that?
Oh yeah, yeah. Control. It probably wouldn't be called an anxiety disorder at that point, but a lot of other issues. Eating disorders are really ultimately about control and relationships. They're not really about food. And usually, if you find somebody with an eating disorder, you find somebody who's a family that's very controlling, and the kid is saying, "You're trying to control me? You can't control what I eat." Now they wouldn't say that. That's not that. They don't because if you work with adolescents, they don't have abstract reasoning, so their heart and their head are not connected. They don't know why they do most of what they do. They're more reactors than they are but yeah, there are some people that their reaction to when people are trying to over control them is to kind of let it all go.
Show you.
Yeah, I'll show you. Hey, when we talk about people misbehave, kids misbehave for about 4 reasons. They want power, they want revenge, they want attention, or they want to be left alone. And in that case, the kid frustrates his parents. I'm not going to do it, hoping that eventually they'll leave him alone. He has power. It's just helpful to know that. Most of the time, you rebel. I mean, you realize that the essence of all of your sin, what's underneath your sin is a belief that God is not good and that you'll take care of it yourself. I mean, the real issue but beneath our sinful behavior is a belief God can't be counted on, I'll take care of it myself. Thanks, but no thanks, I'll take care of it myself. And that same attitude is true when our kids misbehave as well as when we misbehave. But we'll talk about parenting later, but that was a great question. Yes?
With OCD, a lot of times, like the courts or those kind of like getting locked on something or having a repeated behavior. Where does that fear, like, because oftentimes it's accompanied by a fear that if I don't do this way, or then something bad's going to happen to me. Like, where does that come from? If it's about control, like, where does that fear?
Well, often the obsessions that people have, or the compulsive behaviors that people have, like I've got to shut the door. Right. There is some way in which that compulsive behavior is relaxing. It's like, oh, if I do this enough, I'll get. My son Skylar involuntarily, when he gets real nervous, does this thing with his hands that he doesn't even realize. He's kind of does it, it's some sort of neurological thing that goes on, but he does it compulsively with his hands when he gets nervous, and he makes kind of a little, and I don't know where, so. But in people who have a very anxious places and are very frustrated and there's some helpful things they can do to kind of to get their brain to cooperate with them a little more medically and that sort of stuff, and encourage people to do that. What you can talk to them about is where in your life do you feel out of control? Now, typically, people who have an anxious personality, sometimes you'll find that there was places in their early life that was historically out of control. Somebody who was sexually abused, for example. They tend to be very controlling later on in their lives. And you go, well, why? But because there was a point when they were out of control, or life was out of control, they couldn't control the things they wanted to, and there was kind of some sort of almost an emotional vow, I will never be in a place where I'm out of control again. And that vow then kind of becomes their mandate to how they live. And so you find them 15 years later, 20 years later, and they're an incredibly controlling people. And it's really a reaction that's been going on historically. So I always think in 2 categories with anxiety disorders. And again, this is not medical diagnosis. I'm not asking you to do diagnosis. I'm not asking you to do therapy. I'm just saying if you're talking to somebody and anxiety is the issue before them, you want to talk to them about trusting God. You want to help them. You want to help them have behaviors. The opposite of anxious behaviors are relaxing behaviors. Help them breathe slowly. Help them to kind of, you ought to know how to help somebody who's having a panic attack to breathe slowly, slow breaths in, slow breaths out. You should be able to help somebody who's who's doing that sort of stuff. But and those sort of things can be very, very helpful for people with anxiety disorders. The academy, a lot of people are now talking about mindfulness is helpful. And there's a lot of research on mindfulness. And mindfulness is really essentially meditation and stuff that kind of has a Eastern religion piece to it. But it's our old history of meditation and prayer that without God and Jesus is mindfulness at some level. And it's just that kind of idea of grounding and that sort of stuff. And the reason why that makes you less anxious when you do that sort of stuff. So you need to know the behavioral piece, and you need to know, of how do I help people be. And then after you've kind of helped with some of that symptom stuff, to have a conversation about is there anything going on in your life that feels out of control right now? Why do you ask that? Well, I'm just curious. When I get nervous, usually there's things out of control. Anything going on like that for you? And there is some power in just things being brought out in the open. God is the God of light. And Satan loves us to keep all our stuff inside of us and have secrets. And so that's kind of the direction that goes. Does that make sense? Anxiety, those are kind of anxiety disorders. I've tried to say to you, hey, brains are different. You have to be very sensitive to the fact that brains are different. There's really pretty good medicine to help people with kind of slowing their brains down. But you now have a category to kind of talk about those things. Let me real quickly just name some of the disorders that you might have people say to you they have, just so you're aware. One of those might be, you might hear people say they have post-traumatic stress disorder. And that sounds pretty impressive. PTSD. Everybody's heard somebody talk about PTSD. A lot of soldiers have PTSD. Your grandfather, that's not a new disorder. Your great-grandfather, coming back from World War I, they used to call it combat fatigue. And it was the idea that when people would go in a stressful, life-threatening situation, they tend to, there's kind of a thing that God built in us that it's often called the fight for flight part of us. So if all of a sudden somebody came in here with a machine gun, I do not have one with me, so I think we're safe at this point. What would happen is adrenaline would just get pumped into your system. And that adrenaline is supposed to help you either run or go chase the guy down. There is a third thing that sometimes happens, not often, but what if somebody comes in and your adrenaline gets pumped up and it's like, I want to fight or I want to run, but you instead can't do anything and it just freezes. Well, that's kind of the genesis of PTSD. When your life is threatened, and so people that have had traumatic, a lot of the first responders will sometimes have this sort of stuff. They've had traumatic, life-changing, life-threatening events in their life. People in the military, rape victims, people that were at a bank when it was robbed, stuff where their life felt threatened, but they couldn't do anything. They couldn't fight, they couldn't run, and they just froze. And sometimes that stuff just gets kind of stuck in them, and then it starts to, if it froze, we'll just use that analogy, and it's not literal, but then it starts to thaw out over time. And they have dreams. And ultimately, post-traumatic stress disorder is a disorder of avoidance. And people are trying to avoid the things that have caused them trauma, but they're intrusive and they keep coming back in their mind through dreams or through triggers. Like they'll hear a noise that reminds them of the noise that took place that day, and they overreact, and they tend to become hypervigilant, and they become disconnected from other people and dissociate a little bit. Dissociate is just a fancy word for they just aren't very connected to the people around them. And that's post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, should you be doing a group on post-traumatic stress disorder? No. But if you know somebody who's come back from the military, my son has a friend who went to Afghanistan after high school, and he's just now back, and he went to church with us, and he said, could we sit in the back? And he wanted to be able to see everything. He wanted to sit, and I noticed how nervous he was, and so I just said to him, I said, it's none of my business, but have you talked to anybody about the experience of being a soldier and about your life being threatened and seeing friends of yours die and what that's like now to be in a place, to walk through the mall now? Have you talked to anybody about that? And he goes, no, but it's really, it's really messing me up. And I said, I bet your sleep's not doing very well. He goes, well, no, it's not. And so it's helpful. Now, I didn't say, well, I'm a psychologist as well as your friend's dad, so why don't you come over to our house and let's talk about it? No, that's not my role in his life. But my role was to say, you're a man worth fighting for. I appreciate your service to our country, and you've got something going on that that can be dealt with. And it makes sense. It doesn't feel like it makes sense inside of you. But that's one disorder. Another would be obsessive compulsive disorder, which would fall in that. Panic attacks tend to be around these sort of things. Typically, there are triggers around panic attacks, not always, but but panic attacks. If you've never had a panic attack, it's kind of your body saying to your mind, and I know that's not real. I know your body doesn't really talk to your mind. It's not like they're separate things, but it's almost like your body saying, "Enough." And now, I remember back when I was in school, I would always get sick during fall break and during Christmas break because, I'd be studying so much and I'd be so, and it's almost like my body said, you've treated us so badly. Now you finally get a break. You're getting a cold. You were going down. And it's almost like, you should never have, eaten a whole thing of raw cookie dough and stayed up all night. That just is not a good way to study. You are going to pay a price now. And that's essentially kind of your body saying to your mind, stop it. And at some level, oversimplified. Oh, so oversimplified. But that's kind of the panic attack stuff. It's almost that sort of stuff. So, but that's an issue of control. Then there's a disorder called generalized anxiety disorder. That's what generals have. That's not true. But it's just somebody. It's what you would have called. It's what your grandmother would have called a nervous Nelly. Somebody who's just anxious and that sort of stuff. So, yes.
So I guess I misunderstood. I thought obsessive compulsive disorder was the organizing, but you put that in the category of people that are anxious. Thought OCD was like you said, everything's in a row. So it's just more panic attack or what?
Oh no. All of these disorders fall under anxiety disorders, and so all of these fall under. If you were to look at the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Disorders, which you shouldn't look at, it's not an exciting book. But if you were to look at that, you would see all these under the same category, anxiety, and you go, boy, why is obsessive compulsive with PTSD? Why is PTSD with general anxiety? Why are panic attacks with? It's because they all have this common sense of control underneath it. And so those are just some questions to ask. And remember, yes?
When do you draw the line between someone that just needs to trust the Lord as far as just generally kind of anxious versus general anxious or general anxiety disorder? When does it cross out of something that's normal into a disorder if it's something just general?
The truth is, we all are supposed to trust the Lord, and none of us trust the Lord the way we should. And just make sure that you're giving the person with a very anxious brain some grace, because it may not be as easy for them to look like they're trusting the Lord as a guy with a farmer brain. But God wants everybody on that continuum to trust Him. It may look a little different for this person to trust Him than this person to trust Him, but nobody gets a pass. These disorders don't give you a pass. I mean, it doesn't give you a pass. I mean, all of us, it's true for everybody, no matter what your brain is like, that life doesn't work on this side of heaven the way you want. We're all homesick for Eden. We are. there is a longing for a world. I think Lewis said it real well when he said, there's a point you come to in your life where you realize you were made for more. And that's true. And so all of us need to trust the Lord more. Just have the grace to know that it may not always look the same. Just like he and I both need to be concerned about having good health, but it's going to look different for the two of us because we've got different bodies. But faithfulness to Christ is not you don't get a pass because your brain's faster. It may look a little different, but you don't get a pass. And there's a place to say, hey, listen, I know it looks different for you and me, and I know it's a little harder for you, but I think there's some places of and this is where the research. And by the way, I don't think you have to. I don't think there's this false dichotomy between you can't be a person of science and a person of faith. I think that's a false dichotomy. I think both of those are true. And I think whenever science disagrees with Scripture, either you're misinterpreting Scripture or science hasn't caught up yet with Scripture. And so it's not this kind of false dichotomy of we're not going to look at science. But to say to somebody, listen, what the science tells us is that meditation, which in our world, see, the academy is not going to use our terminology. They're not going to say, trust Jesus more and pray. They're going to talk about mindfulness, and meditation is helpful for people that are anxious. Well, let's translate that into the Bible. And what the research is saying is people that meditate and pray, it helps ground them. It helps settle them down. And so that's something we can do. We all could do more of that. And that should make all of us a little less anxious.
Sometimes on a college campus, you'll hear like a phrase like social anxiety. Is that like a disorder in and of itself, or would it just like fall underneath as a symptom of other disorders?
There is a disorder called agoraphobia, which literally means fear of the marketplace. And that's somebody who's afraid to get out, social anxiety. And the idea of speaking in front of people and the idea of, that's a real thing. That's a real phobia. And sometimes those are symbolic. People that are afraid of spiders or, I think we're all afraid of spiders. I think they're evil. But sometimes phobias can be kind of symbolic. The person who's overly concerned about about germs. Sometimes that might be a little obsessive compulsive behavior, but it's also there may be something that they, if they looked at, they would connect that together. But yeah, and that's under that same big umbrella of anxiety disorders.
I work mainly with marriage and parenting, but I solely believe that early childhood experiences like trauma affects you. Can you speak a little bit about, I see it within the context of spouses arguing or parenting. Can you speak a little bit about maybe combating those anxious thoughts? From a biblical perspective, I call it renewing the mind. From secular cognitive behavior therapy. So just changing, looking for truths that combat those negative thoughts.
Yeah, I think there's a real lie out there that kids are little children are resilient. The truth is, children do survive. That is true. But children are very susceptible to trauma and have a way of, it can be very shaping to them. And you'd say, well, that's just your little scientific stuff. No, Jesus gets pretty upset when he talks about someone harming an innocent child, because he knows that stuff that happens to children tends to linger in their lives. It tends to set patterns. When you're first born, you only have a couple of file folders to put data in. You can just kind of imagine the brain as a place of file folders. When you're first born, you got good, bad, happy, sad. I mean, there's only 4 or 5 file folders. And so something happens, it's got to get into one of those file folders. There's not a lot of categories. And so they have a tendency to then stick with them the rest of their lives. And so those are some things to be aware of. We'll talk about parenting in a little bit as we have time today. But yeah, I think parents ought to be concerned about the anxiety they're creating, in their homes. I think that's a wise thing to be aware of. So, one more question, and then we're going to move past anxiety. Yes.
Just from a psychological standpoint, what would you say is kind of the like with blocking out memories or suppressed memories? What is kind of the reason behind that?
Yeah, they'll just say that, and that your memories aren't accurate, but they're true. A memory, to have a memory involves encoding, it calls storage and retrieval, and you lose a little bit in every one of those. You can't possibly encode everything. You can't possibly store everything, and the storage in our brain is not so sophisticated that some things don't bleed into the storage of others. And have you ever been in a situation where two people we're at the same place, they tell a story, and they go, I tell you what, I'll never forget. And then it's like, were you in the same place as me? Some of that's happened with your brother and sisters, I would bet, where you'll say, it was so horrible. Dad was so angry all the time. And your brother goes, Dad? I don't know. It was. And you go, you remember it differently. So our memories aren't technically as accurate as we think they are. They tend to be true, though, in the fact that if you feel kind of unsafe about something, there was probably something unsafe that happened. So I trust. I don't usually do a thing with people with memories of, was it really on Tuesday at 2? That happened. I usually say, so in general, you're saying you grew up in a place that was difficult. But people do repress memories, but the truth is most people do remember traumatic. I mean, the vast majority of people do remember traumatic events. We are capable of suppressing things that we don't like. We have a tendency to focus on what we tend to focus on what we kind of what's set up in our brain. So that's why what happens in children is pretty significant. It kind of sets up what we look for. We've all had that experience. I think I used the example yesterday where I'm thinking we're trying to buy a car because my daughter has stolen our car and it's now in Gainesville with Gator stickers all over it. And so we just have one car, and so we've been looking at cars, and I looked and somebody sits, and so I looked at a Toyota truck, and before I looked at it, I thought, I never see any of these on the road. I don't think I don't think Toyota's done very well, but I usually see just Fords and Chevys. But then I looked at it. And it's amazing. Thousands of people bought Toyota trucks that day, evidently, because now I saw them everywhere. Now, the truth is, the number of them on the road didn't change. My focus changed, and now all of a sudden I'm seeing them everywhere. I am in the most non-masculine car right now that you have ever seen. Whenever I use somebody else's money, which I'm using this weekend, I just put down economy car, and you just get what you get. And so I was put in a powder blue VW Beetle. I barely fit in it. It looks like I'm getting in a clown car. I mean, it's like, because I barely fit in this thing. And so I walk out. It's right out there. You can see it. It was really embarrassing when I pulled into the. I'm not used to the little key fob, and I accidentally hit the. Embarrassed enough that I'm getting out of it. I accidentally hit the panic button, and so now. So it's bad enough that I'm going to be getting out of this powder blue VW, bug. But I've got it now. Now I've got it going, and then we go, what is that? And I was like, who's that giant getting out of that little car? But it's funny. I've only been driving it since Thursday night at 10 o'clock, and I never noticed them on the road. But literally, just driving the 8 miles back and forth from the hotel to here, I've seen hundreds of them. Now, why? Because I'm looking for them. Now I didn't get up in the morning and say, I want to see one of these ugly little cars. No, it's your mind. So memory is a little bit that way. You kind of remember, but it is possible. There are people that some things are so traumatic they're forgotten. People that had very significant trauma in their lives, sometimes early especially, will forget, can forget. But the research says most people remember trauma at some level, or remember parts of it. Remember, memories and stories are connected. And often when you remember one thing and you talk about it, it'll open up the next thing and the next thing. And so stories are kind of connected. So remember, our goal today is to give you, not to have you do therapy with people. Don't want you to do therapy with people. That's above your pay grade. Don't want you to diagnose anybody. Don't want you to try to say, well, you need to think about some medicine. But what I want you to do is, what could you talk about? What would be some categories to help you? And when I think of anxiety disorders, all those things we just talked about, I think of the issue of control. Now, let me just talk real quick about the idea of kind of how you see problems and solutions. If there's a boat going down, there's two problems. There's a hole in the bottom of the boat, and there is water filling up the boat. Both of those are problems. You've got to both bail and fix the hole at the bottom. There's actually, from what I've been told, at the Naval Academy, there's actually a pool that is set up like the hull of a boat, and it's an exercise where they will take the cadets and they'll put them down in this hull, and then they'll turn on the water, and they then have to figure out. They have to do two things. They have to make sure that they're emptying the water with pumps or whatever, and make sure they're doing some of that, and they need to make sure that they're fixing the hole at the bottom. If all they do, or if they do too much pumping, then the pump motors will burn out and they'll go down, because eventually you can't bail forever. Eventually you get tired of bailing. However, if they don't bail some and just try to fix the hole at the bottom of the boat, the thing goes down. You think, why are we talking about that? Human beings are that way. There are surface things, behavioral things, cognitive behavioral things. There's surface things that are going on in somebody's life. And then there's core, what the old Puritans used to call the sin beneath the sin. And you want to at least have your mind on the fact that there's both of those things happening. We as Christians have tended to focus on bailing. And so we somebody's struggling, we say, we need to quit struggling, or you need to try this or try that. And it's helpful some, but we basically often will tell people, well, you need to bail. And we just kind of teach them to bail. Eventually, people get tired of bailing if you don't also deal with the issues beneath. So you talk about anxiety disorders, and you're going to say, well, you need to trust Jesus, you need to pray, you need to memorize this verse, those are all great bailing strategies. But you also want to be talking about the issues of control that are underneath the waterline that's filling the boat. It's true about depression as well. Quite frankly, what would your grandmother say to you if you were depressed? Here's what my grandmother would have said. My grandmother, if you were depressed, would have given your grandmother rules, and it'd been like, are you sleeping enough? Are you eating your vegetables? Are you exercising? Are you going to church? Those are grandmother rules, right? Be with people, eat, exercise, and make sure you're sleeping. Take care of yourself. That's what your grandmother would say. Truth is, that's pretty helpful. But it's bailing strategies. And so when you're sitting with somebody who's depressed, it's helpful to say, well, you know, have you exercised? Are you exercising? Are you getting out? Are you spending time with people? Are you, you know, it's helpful to give them bailing strategies, grandmother's strategies. Those are good. But you also want to help them kind of see some of the things beneath the water. And some counselors only focus on behavioral, on bailing. And some tend to focus on what's underneath. And you want to kind of find people that deal both. Does that make sense? All right. We're going to take, it's 10 o'clock, so we're going to take a break. Here's what we've done so far today. We've taken the second most common disorder, if you will, or a category of disorders. The first would be mood disorders like depression, affect, depression. We talked a little bit about bipolar and suicide and all that stuff yesterday. That's the most common. That's the common cold. We've talked about depression. And then now we talked about the second most common thing you'll deal with is anxiety. By the way, is anxiety going up or down in our society?
Up.
Why do you think that's the case? You're right.
Control? Yeah, we feel like we have less control.
We feel like we have less control. The 24-hour news cycle, even though the statistics would say violence is down, not up. I mean, historically over time. You hear about it now all the time. After 9/11, anxiety went up in our country. Why? Because the sense of control was gone. I had, so that's kind of the deal. So let's take a real short break, and then we'll kind of talk about addictions, which would be probably the next thing you'll deal with.